Greetings. Today I'd like to focus some attention on Chapter 2, Research Methods in Criminology. One of the nice things about this chapter is that it really sets a nice baseline and provides information that will be very useful in all the rest of the chapters. So this is very important to read this chapter and really get a good understanding of the material. Your author points out that theory really addresses the questions of why and how, while methodology or the research methods is more concerned with what is. In essence, though, both theory and methodology are very important and integrated in criminal justice work. So theory attempts to, according to your author, structure, summarize, or explain elements of the subject in question. In this scenario in our class, we're attempting to structure, summarize, or explain the major elements of crime. And we have a variety of research methods that we use to support or refute our theories. Now, one of the important things to realize is that a lot of the theories and methods that we use in criminal justice are also used in sociology, psychology, anthropology, political science, and so on. A research question would be how much crime is there in our community, or who is committing a particular crime in our community. And so we can get all those statistics and present them. And sometimes you have a lot of people getting in debates on those statistics, and we'll get into that later. But also, behind all that is explanations, which really are the theories. So if we see that the homicide rate has increased in a particular community, we might present certain research methods to collect data to determine homicide rates, and then look at the trends and patterns. And then we might see that there's particular groups that are more likely to be at risk for homicide, or homicide might occur in a particular geographical location. And those are what we find with our methods, but then we have to explain that. Well, why is that the case? How is that occurring? And that really gets more to our theories. And in this course, you'll see a variety of theories that are presented, and some of the research findings that support or refute those theories. Some of the other features discussed in research methodology is trying to be as objective as possible and to try to check our personal biases, although some would argue that we already have a bias when we decide what we're going to study. Also, we have codes of ethics that we must follow. So we make sure, for example, that the participants are provided informed consent, that they have an understanding of the study that we're conducting. They agree to participate in the study. They know that they can withdraw from the study at any time. And we also may keep the information confidential. They may remain anonymous. So we go over that before we conduct a study, and actually we present a proposal to conduct a research study, and then we submit it to the IRB, the Institutional Review Board here at the university, that reviews the study to see if there's any ethical issues that may come up, and then we address those. So really the Institutional Review Board really helps to make sure and check that our research is going to be ethical. And often institutional review boards can offer some excellent suggestions to make some changes to make sure that we carry out our research in the most ethical way possible. There's some examples in your textbook of controversial social science, and of course in some cases clearly unethical, and you can read over those. And then there's others where it may not be unethical, but it was extremely controversial. And also the time period is relevant as well when these studies were conducted. Your author asks, who is criminal? So what is the population that we identify as criminal? And then he talks about some of the items of interest in any research study. A variable, that's something that can vary. And, for example, gender is a variable, male, female, other. Income is a variable, and that can be operationalized or measured in a variety of ways. We may ask people, how much do you make a year? And we want to know, $10,250, 5.2 million. Or we could ask people, do you make between, under $25,000, $25,001 to $50,000, or we can structure it however we want. But operationalization is the process of defining our variables, our concepts, that is, giving details on how they're measured. So if I'm talking about violence in the media, we have to clearly know, what am I talking about by media, but also how do I define violence? And so you'll see in a lot of studies there's different ways of operationalizing variables, and that's important to realize. Also explains why sometimes it's difficult to compare studies. Also, your author talks about some of the official police statistics, for example, the Uniform Crime Report, and talks about index crimes. Part 1, crimes are violent. Crime index, part 1 crimes, also property crime index. And then we have the part 2 crimes, which are non-index offenses that are not used in the calculation of crime rates, but you still can use those in research. A lot of times you'll see that the Uniform Crime Report is presented for cities and states and the whole country, focusing, for example, on homicide, rape, assault, and so on. And one of the problems with there's a whole bunch of problems with the Uniform Crime Report, is that, first of all, a lot of crimes are not reported. They're just not reported at all. And, some crimes are more likely to be reported than others. Homicides and auto theft are much more likely to be reported than, for example, sexual assault. Also, the definitions of crime vary across locations, or jurisdictions rather, and there may be changes in how a crime is defined or reported or recorded, and that can change the statistics. You want to lower your crime rate in the community, just remove some behaviors or activities as being criminal. You want to increase it, you could go after that particular crime more strongly. It doesn't necessarily mean that then more is occurring, but there's higher arrest rates because we're going after that particular crime. So there's all these factors that can go into it. And also the Uniform Crime Reports only counts the most serious crime for each incident. So there could be about 4 or 5 crimes occurring, but the most serious one is counted. For example, there may be an assault and a rape and a homicide, and then the homicide be counted, and you wouldn't know about the other two. And also the crime index leaves out most crimes, and so that becomes a problem. But what's real important to recognize is the use of the crime rate, which is the total number of index crimes per 100,000 in the population. And you calculate that by crime rate basically is the index crimes divided by the population times 100,000. So you hear people talking about, the homicide rate being 3.2 per 100,000 or 5.7 per 100,000 or 7 per 100,000, and for all the other ones. This allows us to take into consideration the population and to look at the actual rate so we can compare across jurisdictions. Using the numbers can be problematic if you think about it. Let's say there's 2 cities. One city has 1,000 people living there, very small city, and another city has 2.5 million. The small city has, let's say, 25 homicides, and the large city has, let's say, 200 homicides. Okay, so you know which had more, but numerically, but you want to consider the population. And so you'd actually calculate crime rates to compare those cities. So it would be a rate. The index crime of interest divided by the population times 100,000. It's a big problem here in Orlando because we have a lot of tourists. So what if tourists are victimized, but they're not counted as the population? Does that make our crime rate, appear higher, or do we go ahead and do we just count residents and then count tourists and then combine and have different rates to look at? And then there's certain events that can happen where we might include that in our annual crime statistics, but also exclude that as well to add clarity to what the patterns or trends are. For example, if there's a catastrophic event that occurs, that we wouldn't want to include that in the crime rate, with and then not let people know what had happened. Even though, of course, they should understand what happened, but years from now they may just think there was a big spike in the crime rate. A lot of times you'll see the stats calculated with and without particular events. And we also have the NIBRS, the National Incident-Based Reporting System. That's a pretty good system because it gets into much more details. Not all police departments use it, and so it's kind of spotty, but you got much more detail. For example, attempted from completed offenses are in there, and there's a lot more offenses included, on also more details on offender, victim, witnesses, time and location of offense. So that's a really useful data set to use. And again, you can get the Uniform Crime Reports, the NIBRS reports online from the National Institute of Justice and some of the other criminal justice stat online sites. And then your author talks about quantitative methods versus qualitative methods. Quantitative meaning more the use of numbers and statistics, and qualitative is more descriptive and attitudinal or behavioral measures to understand crime trends. A lot of times we could actually conduct quantitative and qualitative studies in a mixed mode research program to really begin to answer our questions. A lot of criminal justice research is quantitative in nature, but there certainly has been an increased interest in qualitative methods, although dominant methods are definitely quantitative, I'd say. I like qualitative methods myself, but I like using both. And then your author talks about some data gathering strategies, such as the experiment and the classical experiment. And, if you tell a story here, you can kind of get it. So I'll try to do that and then wrap up this particular video. But I talk about having an experimental and a control group. The experimental group gets something, the control group doesn't. So let's say we're interested in looking at the effects of attitudes toward violence, and we're interested in looking at if there's an influence from watching a violent film or not. So first of all, the ideal situation is to, at random, select from the population of interest a group, and then use random assignment to go ahead and assign some randomly, so everyone has the same chance of being in one group or the other, to go ahead and assign a certain number to the experimental group and a certain number to the control group. Now you can have multiple experimental groups. So let's say that the experimental group watches a very, very violent film. Let's say they watch, Dawn of the Dead. And then the control group watches, let's say, Waterfalls of America. I mean, you could have another experimental group. You could have, another group watch The Kardashians. But you know what? I have no clue how we'd classify that. So let's just go with kind of a non-violent, which would be Waterfalls of America, and violent, Dawn of the Dead. And so a lot of times we want to do a pretest. So we use a reliable and valid instrument, a violent scale, attitudinal scale, we give that to everyone in the experimental control group before. The experimental group watches Dawn of the Dead. The control group watches Waterfalls of America. And then afterwards, we give them the post-test again. And some might argue, well, you don't want to give them the test, the exact one again, and so soon. That would be a problem. So you could actually, if you randomly select from the population and assign to the groups, you might skip that pretest, assuming they're probably similar. And then you could actually have groups divide that more. Some groups get the pretest and some don't, and vary that more and get into like a Solomon design. And then you can measure again and you see if there's any differences. Of course, you want to know if there are differences before they see the films, and then are there any differences after they see the films. That's just to kind of give you an idea there. And then, of course, you want to know, is there effect that lasts? So you might want to carry out some longitudinal research and follow up 6 months, 1 year down the road. A lot of times in treatment programs, we have somewhat of this classical experimental design to see if the program worked. One group gets drug court, one group doesn't, and then we follow them, for example. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up right here so we don't get too long of a video. And in part 2, I will continue talking about some other research methods.